Okay, so Ecclesiastes is kind of a strange little book. I was just I was just thinking about this morning. I wondered how many times does Ecclesiastes show up in the liturgy? And as far as I can tell, through Google helped me for maybe 3 minutes. I didn't spend a lot of time on it. But as far as I can tell, it shows up twice. And once is it's one of the readings for daily mass in the fall, in ordinary time. I'm trying to remember. It was paired with I can't remember which gospel reading, but it was something. Was kind of, sometimes they fit together really nicely. Today I kind of thought fit together kind of nicely, but sometimes they don't seem to have anything to do with each other. It was more
well
like
with
that.
today's class too, I thought.
Yes, it did. Oh my goodness, yes. But then, and it was Ecclesiastes 3. There's a time for everything. So that's the one reading that shows up in the ordinary time mass readings, and the only other time that I can find is for funeral masses, and it's the same reading. So Ecclesiastes chapter 3.
Selections.
Yes, it's one of the possibilities. I think most Catholic funerals I've been to have picked out that reading from Wisdom of Solomon, which is a little bit more.
Sparks among stubble.
Yeah. It's more explicitly about the resurrection. And this is interesting. We have these two texts that are attributed to Solomon, and they're very, very different. And they have very different kind of eschatological outlook, really. Ecclesiastes, we'll talk more about this. Ecclesiastes has a very, it's very agnostic about the afterlife. If you've noticed that, it says, who knows what happens, when you die. So you better take advantage of life now, because you don't know what's coming after. And the Wisdom of Solomon is very much saying that there's going to be a resurrection, and those who don't have a very good life in this life, they've got good things waiting for them in the future. So very different outlooks, but they're both attributed to Solomon. And that's one of the things, really briefly, maybe we should talk about, is we don't know who wrote Ecclesiastes. This bothers sometimes modern Christians, because the questions of authorship are really important to us. Sometimes we have this idea that if we don't know who wrote something, then we can't really understand it, or we can't appreciate it, or maybe it makes it illegitimate if the person that is said to have authored it didn't really author it. Big debates about Shakespeare's plays, right? A lot of people question the author, and this is a very modern sort of thing. Same thing with Homer. Before they were doing it with the Bible, they were doing it with Homer. But the Jewish people and the ancient church, they didn't really care about questions of authorship like we do. And it just didn't. And if you were writing a book and you wanted to make sure it got read, you might take on the persona of a great hero of the past. And you weren't lying, you weren't creating a forgery. The people who received this book knew that this wasn't really written by so-and-so. They were just, it's kind of a literary conceit. A way, with Ecclesiastes, this is even, I think this literary conceit goes beyond trying to get it published. I think it has something to do with just trying to enter into the story of Solomon and think about it from a philosophical point of view. That's what's going on here.
I think if you read it thinking of Solomon, to me it makes its points differently. So I think if the author made no reference to Solomon, we would lose something in the interpretation.
Absolutely. So Solomon, he looms large in the background. Even though, if you read Ecclesiastes, Solomon is not named once.
Right.
Which is also interesting.
Yeah.
But it's obvious that it's talking about Solomon. So, traditionally ascribed to Solomon, Solomon is, and that's because it does seem that there's this kind of literary fiction going on, but at the same time, it's drawn from real experiences in Solomon's life, I think. Solomon may have written it. We don't know. I don't think he did. Doesn't matter. That's the big point. I will say, I've already mentioned this, when you read the commentaries and the scholarship on books like this, they get obsessed with those sorts of questions, and it leads them into weird sorts of places that are, so one of the big things that was popular maybe 100 years ago, and it still shows up in the literature, is that Ecclesiastes couldn't have come about without some Greek philosophy being in the background. And I don't think whoever wrote it needed the Greeks to come up with these ideas. They were already in the fabric of the Middle East, but that goes back to some kind of anti-Semitic points of view, that the Jewish people surely aren't, wise enough to come up with this kind of profundity on their own. They need some help from us European types. That's still without that anti-Semitic edge, but it still shows up in the literature. I don't think it really has any Greek background, though. It has points of contact with Stoicism and Epicureanism. It'd be interesting to get these guys in a room together. I think they would have a fascinating discussion. But it's not dependent upon them.
And maybe go home and write something.
And maybe go home and write something. Maybe. So another problem with Ecclesiastes is we're not sure when it was written. Again, the literature will say it was written very late, and that has something to do with it having to supposedly be derived from Greek philosophy. I'm not sure it's as young as a lot of the literature makes it out to be. Probably not from the time of Solomon. Maybe, I'd say probably post-exilic, after the 6th century BC, but anywhere between that and the time of, like maybe 100 BC. Anywhere in that space. I'm not sure where it falls.
Before the Book of Wisdom?
I think it was written well before the Book of Wisdom. I do think, this is part of the reason I think it's older than most commentaries will say it is because it is so agnostic about the afterlife. And about the, in the 3rd century, the 3rd century BC, you begin to have speculations about resurrection. And so by the 2nd century BC, the doctrine of the resurrection has come fully emerged, and that was the major view of the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. So Ecclesiastes doesn't seem to be aware of that.
That's when we get Maccabees, right?
Maccabees and Daniel and these texts that really do support the view of the resurrection. And so this is one of the things that's wonderful about the Old Testament. To me, it's wonderful, because I'm geeking out a little bit. When you read the New Testament, that all came to us in a very short period of time. And it's kind of difficult to see. You can see some, but it's hard to find development in the New Testament, because it's all pretty much right there when it's given to us. But in the Old Testament, as you read it, as you're comparing these different pieces that were written at different times, you can see a growing awareness of certain concepts. And so when you compare Ecclesiastes and Wisdom of Solomon, for instance, you can see a marked difference in what they're teaching about the afterlife. And sometimes, again, that bothers people, because they see that as a contradiction. And I think it's just, God in a way is letting us in on how He's revealed Himself to us over time and brought His people to a deeper understanding of the truth.
You hit on a couple of, at least 2 different layers of what we believe about divine inspiration.
Yeah.
One was when you were talking about our kind of modern obsession with authorship.
Yeah.
Do you think that comes a little bit from our misunderstanding of of how the authorship of Scripture and kind of that combination, the divine authorship of Scripture is that we focus on the individual. If we say that this is gospel because we believe that one of the disciples of Jesus certainly wrote it from start to finish, and it's based on the authority of the person rather than the authority of the Holy Spirit. Do you think that has something to do with it? Is that
absolutely.
And I'm thinking both of these might be points of difference between us and non-Catholic Christians. You also mentioned kind of the flatness of our thought on how revelation occurs, and so you talk about the development. So I think that's interesting with, but even to use a larger divide of, you see it within the Old Testament itself, but certainly if you look at Scripture as a whole, New Testament, we always complement, if you will, the Old Testament with the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
So when we read something that's kind of confusing in the Old Testament, we say, well, what does Jesus say about it? Or
That's right.
But if you have a really flat view of divine revelation, you can't really do that, can you?
I
Or
don't
it's harder
think so.
to do that.
Yeah. It depends on, different Protestants have different ways of going about that. But yeah, I mean, if you cite a Bible verse out of context, you can come up with all sorts of things. And the Old Testament is really useful for that in some ways, because it has these kind of strange texts in it. So that's really good. This point about authorship, I think you're right. The Jewish people and the early church, they saw the Bible as given to us primarily by God. And so questions of human authorship, they weren't as interested in it because the human author is kind of, he's the vessel by which the Scriptures came to us, but beyond that, they're not. But what happened, ironically, fundamentalism wouldn't be able to exist without liberal Protestant historical criticism. And those questions about authorship and inspiration and legitimacy, all those emerge after the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And fundamentalism comes back at it as a response, but it's using the same tools. So this isn't a lecture on fundamentalism and liberalism, but both of them, they're basically two sides of the same coin.
Yep.
And that's you don't find that obsession over those sorts of questions in older literature. There's speculation, of course. You have all kinds of midrash that says, "Oh, this must have been written by so and so," but it's more frivolous in a way. They're not making it a point of faith.
We do that with, which I think you can see the same kind of strange bedfellows going on in a lot of, even politically and historically.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, we do that. Like I've had conversations with people on politics, for example, and I'll mention something about the Constitution, and they'll say, "Well, those men had slaves, for example. So whatever they wrote, we could basically throw that out." So there's this kind of modern inability to grasp like the essence of a thing that exists to the exclusion of maybe some of the flaws of the people.
Right.
And I suppose you could apply that analogy even to crisis in the church, et cetera,
Oh, yeah.
that we tend to focus on, like, tell me about this person, and do I accept this person? And if I don't accept this person, then I'll throw out the thing. And it's kind of getting the cart before the horse, if you will.
Yeah.
Stephanie, you had
I've heard there's a trend on some Protestants saying that they should reject the Old Testament entirely and just focus on the New Testament. A friend of mine who's, well, it used to be Wesley Christian Church, said that it's kind of cropping up in their discussions.
Where at?
Wesley, well, it used to be Wesley Christian Church, I can't remember what it's called now, but he's an elder there, and he said there's some, it's kind of roiling around in some Protestant circles that just get rid of the Old Testament, don't refer to it, center everything on the old, on the new.
I've not heard that so much. I do know.
There's one particular evangelical evangelist who's trying to.
kind of like a new Marcionism or something.
Yeah.
So I grew up in a church that recognized the Old Testament as divinely inspired, but mostly as kind of a historical relic. So it was a divinely inspired history, and but it didn't have any real application for our lives today because Jesus came and abolished the law.
Yeah.
That was kind of what I was taught.
My
Um,
daughter who, the church, but, yeah, the church that she attends is the Church of Christ. and
Yes, Church of
that's the
Christ.
way they feel.
Yeah. So I grew up in a church that's affiliated with them, like in a So yeah, that and but that's actually a very I find it in Catholic literature too, unfortunately, more and more. So this is something that's in ever since the Reformation. There's been this ambivalence towards the Old Testament because it contains the law, and we're not saved by law, we're saved by grace, and we don't know what to do with the law then. And you know, Jesus, St. Paul has some words about the law in the Old Testament that are ambivalent at best, and so it's difficult without a proper magisterial authority to wind your way through all of that stuff. Yeah, for sure. The Old Testament is hard. The Bible is hard, and Ecclesiastes is hard. Ecclesiastes is a difficult book. We'll look at some of the things that... Ecclesiastes is so hard that you can find conversations in Jewish literature, in the Mishnah, the Talmud, about whether or not Ecclesiastes really belongs in the Bible. And the main reason, I think, for that is because of this ambiguity about what happens after death. Because the resurrection, at that time at least in Jewish circles, was kind of one of those things that everyone had to believe to have fellowship with the synagogues. And if you reject, the Sadducees famously rejected the resurrection. And so the Pharisees, as they are deciding what makes the cut, what's in the canon, this is all a little bit anachronistic. They don't use this kind of language then. But as they're having these conversations, they're wanting to have a Bible that is not Sadducee in any way, shape, or form. And so Ecclesiastes creates some problems for them. But they eventually decide it belongs, and I think it's because, so we talked about the liturgical use of Ecclesiastes in the Catholic Church. The Jewish people also use it liturgically. And they actually read the entire book together as a community during the Feast of Tabernacles. I don't know why. And there is this something about the turning of the seasons then. That might be what it is. And
the fruit of the labor, maybe?
And everything is kind of, the days are getting shorter, winter's coming on, and so maybe this thinking about the shortness of life. But the Feast of Tabernacles is a very joyous holiday. So it's interesting that this rather somber book is the choice for the Feast of Tabernacles. The title is weird, Ecclesiastes. So in Hebrew, Ecclesiastes is the attempt by the Greek translators of the Septuagint to try and translate this weird Hebrew word that only shows up in the title of Ecclesiastes. This word is not one that's used anywhere else, Kohelet. And we have a whiteboard.
There's a marker.
Yeah. You'll see some of the cool, trendy Christian translations. Maybe even the New American Bible, they will use Kohelet. Kohelet says it's the name that the author uses for himself.
Yeah,
Oops.
it does. And then that's what this is. But then I looked at my Ignatius Bible and it's different.
The preacher
Yeah.
or the teacher.
The Docus fingerprint, my Ignatius Bible is tiny.
Well, the problem is, the reason some of the modern translations just use Kohelet is because we don't know what this means. Okay? It's a problem. It seems to be related to another Hebrew word, kahal. Okay? Kahal means assembly. And in my, so when I was attending Catholic Church in Israel, we called our church a Kehillah. Okay? So we have Kohelet, we have assembly, we have, let's say, parish. Okay? So we have this family of words. And we don't know what this means, but it seems to be related to these. And so they wound up translating him as the preacher in the Christian tradition. I think it's a decent translation. I mean, I'm not going to argue with Septuagint, and I'm not going to argue with St. Jerome. But it is something to think about, is what about this book is assembly-ish. You know, it's not the sort, it's only used once in the Catholic Church in all of our readings, because it doesn't lend itself to liturgical use that much, I would say. But it's the one book in our Bible besides Ecclesiastes that is named the church book. So it's a little bit, it's a kind of a riddle of a book. I don't have answers for you on this one. It's just weird.
One of the things I read, I think it was in the introduction to this book in the Navarre edition of the Bible, but and again, just speculation, but the author of that introduction wondered if there was something going on with, and this pertains to something that we were talking about last week, Howard, but that it was almost a subset of, like, in the context of the Feast of Tabernacles, that we've got this joyous celebration, and then, like, almost among that, we've got this preacher, this person assembling people, kind of calling them to, like, a deeper reflection.
In the middle of the revelry,
Yeah.
let's have a sober analysis.
That was this
of what's
author,
going
so
on
I was
here.
just kind of thinking about that. I was trying to read it under that lens of, like, that this is the big celebration going on. Not to undermine that, but that there's kind of like another level of reflection. So it's like, imagine a big party, and then there's like one person trying to, like, let's talk about this a little more deeply, right? Like calling people together.
Oh,
that was
interesting.
his opinion. But we were even just going back to that larger question of, like, why is this a book of consolation? Like, why would this be read?
Well, first of all, we need to talk about that.
Yeah.
So what kind of a book is it? And I think Ecclesiastes unfairly gets treated as kind of a depressing book. Has anyone ever heard that Ecclesiastes is depressing? I grew up here. Somber. I think somber is an adequate adjective for it. I think it is somber, but not in a sorrowful sort of way. When I was growing up, we treated Ecclesiastes as though it was depressing. Like, why do you want to read Ecclesiastes? Because it'll just give you a downer. You just ruin your whole day. You read Ecclesiastes. That's not... Actually, I think it's very somber and sober, but it's really meant to encourage a certain kind of lifestyle, but also a certain kind of reflective way of life, and to encourage people to make the most of life. It's really a carpe diem sort of book. But one thing that Howard's helped me, as we were talking about it last week, really kind of think about this more, is that it's a book of consolation. I don't know.
Yeah, why is that, Howard?
Now we're gonna make you say it.
Did I say that?
You said that.
The problem is he hasn't slept since then.
I know. They're putting them on the spot.
Well, I think if I remember, well, I really don't remember what we were talking about. But anyway, I'll try to piece it together. But, I was thinking about this in relation to, I was thinking about the nature of tragedy, since we just read Antigone, and exactly what is this? I mean, there is something
Yeah.
and this is going back to Aristotle when he talks about this, what's the term he uses? See, my mind's not really working.
I'm sorry.
But anyway, that the audience receives, you're actually you're a spectator to something really, you could say horrific, you know?
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, the audience leaves, well, they have certain feelings kind of purged. In other words, there's a certain kind of elation, or there's a certain kind of consolation in viewing this thing.
Yeah.
That, you know, and I think what I was saying was that it is consoling sometimes to be told the hard truth.
Yeah.
You know, to say, well, sometimes this is really what life is like at times.
Yeah.
I was thinking, this just made me think of an incident from a long time ago, but I was working at a school, and one of my co-workers, a young lady who was a recent convert to the faith, her brother committed suicide.
Oh.
And she, you know, wanted to talk to people about it, and everybody was trying to kind of, you know, let's face it, it's a pretty difficult thing to talk to someone about. You don't really know exactly. And she wanted, you know, she wanted to know the truth. And so I had this friend, and I was there when he started talking to her about it, and he just kind of laid it on the line, and he said, well, you know, objectively, you know, suicide is a mortal sin, and he basically unraveled it. And then he also then said, but there are reasons here for hope, and he presented those also. And she said, thank you.
Wow.
That's what I've been waiting for, someone to tell me. Everybody's been trying to console me without really telling me the truth. So in other words, can you really be consoled without the truth about things? I don't know. So sometimes the hard truth, because this has got a lot of it, you know, there is something, people turn to it. You know, it's a mysterious thing that people, I was telling these guys a story, because this is going to be about my whole contribution right here.
There's an
It's good. It's good.
There's open beds down this hall until 3 o'clock today. So.
Get the spell jacket. But, you know, I had this, well, first of all, I had been reading this with a group of people last fall in a seminar, kind of struggling with it. And to be honest with you, I just knew parts of it. You know, I knew the beginning, I knew the part about the seasons, and I knew that last part, you know. And I really hadn't read the whole thing, and so when I read it, it was like, whoa, this is kind of an eye-opener. And in the group, we were sort of struggling with it. At the same time, then I got some news that one of my former students had died, a guy that really a wonderful, I mean, someone that when I think back on, a really sweet, good kid, had died. I don't know exactly. He was around 30 when he died, and he lived in Oklahoma, and not much news about the nature of why he died. But anyway, I was, you know, I went to the funeral. I thought, well, I ought to go, you know. And there were just so many things about it that made me feel a little bit uneasy. This was a Catholic family, but there wasn't a mass. There was a viewing, but we had a closed, you know, casket, which is not that big a deal. But still, though, it's just kind of, we had a graveyard service. And so I was just thinking, like, what's going on? I just felt like there's just more to the story here, and really, in some ways, what difference does it really make? But, you know, so we left the funeral home and went out to the graveyard. The priest had to come from another, you know, city. I was coming from Tulsa, actually, and he got lost. So all these people are at the graveyard and kind of milling around, and, you know, and time was passing. I mean, really, like an hour, and, you know, everybody's waiting for the priest to show up. And finally, the funeral director said, well, the family says that they would appreciate it if anybody wanted to come forward and share a scripture passage or share a few words. And you know, and I wasn't going to do that. That was for, I mean, I sort of felt like I was sort of, you know, I knew the family really just through their son. I didn't really know the larger community, but you know, I was standing there thinking, wow, what would you read? You know, and I was thinking about passages about the resurrection and things like that. Well, anyway, there was an older gentleman, farmer, went out to his pickup truck. This is great. And went out there, opened up his glove box and found his Bible, brought it back. I thought that was really beautiful. And you could tell he was a little bit, he was struggling with his emotions, but he came back and stood by the casket and by the family and opened up his Bible without fumbling around very much. And he started to read, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die." And he went through and he read the passage, and I'm standing there thinking, oh my gosh. Of course, I had just finished reading and thinking about this thing and the nature of it, like, and it was like, part of me was thinking like, man, I can't believe you're reading that. Have you ever read the whole thing? You know, I mean, you know, like, wow, you know. And yet at the same time, it would, you know, I thought, well, isn't that interesting that he turned to that immediately? And I don't think anybody, I mean, there was consolation there.
Right.
And I thought, well, what is the nature of this consolation? It doesn't quite all make sense. I mean, you know, it's not a very hopeful, I mean, even this passage right here, which is, it is beautiful, and I think part of it, we also mentioned, was that maybe part of the consolation for that, there are a couple of sections here which I think as literature, it's really beautiful, and we find consolation in beauty. And yet at the time, I don't know, I was really, found it very mysterious, and then maybe begin thinking about this. Well, sometimes this is pretty unvarnished truth, you know, it's not dolled up, it's just telling you kind of the way things are from a certain point of view without, I'm not going to say without faith, because there is obviously faith here, but I don't know.
It's not the entire picture.
No.
It's a very, it is written with faith, but from a, you know, like a limited view of Revelation, but still, it's beautiful. You're right. There's a, you compared it, I remember last week, to what we just read in the Meditations. That here, you know, because Marcus Aurelius is composing those often beautiful thoughts. He's compiling all of that as a way to console himself as he's living out on the battlefield, witnessing all the horrors of war and all of this. And he's writing, he's doing philosophy to console himself. And in a way, this is maybe a similar sort of project. We always think about the community that receives these. I mean, something was happening to the author too, and that might have been, you know, at the end of a life, trying to you know, add up the sums of his life and see what does it amount to, and it probably has a consoling factor for the author as well.
Well, that, you know, you can speculate a lot, but, you know, my guess would be whoever wrote this was a person at the end of their life.
Yeah, I would agree.
It would be impossible, well, I shouldn't say that, but, well, I don't think a young person could possibly write that. You know, this is a person who has suffered, who has observed things, and, you
And-
know.
Yeah.
I just, well, about a year and a half ago, I lost my husband, and I know it consoled me because, okay, I was thinking when my husband died about heaven, not a lot. That was excessive, because I was thinking, I just want to go to heaven with my husband, I just want to be there. I don't want to be here anymore. And I understand that feeling of, why am I living this life now when I could be in heaven with God and with my husband, with my people I love? And I think it speaks a little bit to that. We have to live right here,
Yeah.
right now, and we can't just go there because we want to.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks a little bit about you have to live your life now here on earth because God wants you to. And I think that there's some realism about that
Yes.
fact that if you think about this, Jesus says we're going to heaven. Why are we even bothered with
That's
all
right.
this stuff that's happening here? It doesn't even matter anymore. And I think this is saying this moment does matter. This time we have to live it. Does that make kind of
Absolutely.
sense?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's kind of consoling in a way,
Mhm.
in a strange way.
No, that makes a lot of sense. It's a very practical book, and not in the sense of giving you instructions of what to do so much, but it's just trying to wave away all this fantasy that we have, and say this is what you've got. It's wonderful. Oh gosh, but
Sorry, because of what you were saying, I forgot a part of that story, which really kind of speaks to what you're saying. So anyway, the farmer guy, gets up and he reads this, and his voice is trembling, and there's a sense of, the priest finally shows up. And I don't remember. The only thing I remember is that he said, he did the readings, from the breviary or the missal, or the graveyard service. But then he started to ad lib, which was really a mistake.
yeah,
Should have just stick with the liturgy. It's pretty good stuff. And he said, well, this reminds me of a poem, and I wish I could remember it. You've all heard it. Something about it. It's about I'm not really gone. I'm
Yeah.
here.
Oh,
I'm a da-da-da. And I'm a snowflake.
Yeah.
And I'm a raindrop. And
Yeah.
I guess that was written by this Jewish lady in Brooklyn who lost someone, and she wrote that in. And it's just kind of taken off this life of its own. I mean, she probably never even got a copyright on the deal, but anyway. And I remember thinking at the time, like, I'm sorry, I don't find that consoling at all, man. Get the guy with the Bible bag out here, I mean,
Right.
Father, like, it was just so sugar-coated,
Yeah,
kind of like, isn't that
absolutely.
real? I'm sorry, I don't want to be a moonbeam, or whatever, I don't, that doesn't do it for me, pal.
No, you're right.
And it was sad, it really was sad, it was kind of like, and he was a younger guy, but he think, well, gosh, surely you've done a lot of, I don't know. I just, that really brought it home. I thought, well, this kind of saccharine, sweet, sort of mediocre poetry, which is very popular and kind of like Hallmark cards, some people think, well, that's consolation? That's not consolation,
yeah.
Well, I wonder if it has to do with our kind of inability to see the difference between like hope and maybe optimism would be a good
Yeah.
way to explain that. And so like there's something very consoling, I think, depending on your mindset, about knowing that what you can do is finite, right?
Yeah.
Because there can be something very intimidating thinking that we can solve things. And that's probably
Yeah.
that
Because if you don't
point of
solve
view,
things,
it's your fault, right?
Yeah.
And so I think kind of in a secular sense, we create this idea that if like you can manufacture happiness, you can solve practical problems, certainly, if we put our mind to it, right? We can solve any problem we have, we can solve, but even like kind of self-help mentality psychologically that we can kind of overcome feelings of despair or sadness or whatever by like just kind of fabricating joy almost. And this idea that we can't solve things, to somebody from that mindset, admitting that you can't solve problems, that you have to suffer, that's like the antithesis of what they're about. They say that's depressing. But to somebody from that perspective, that's very liberating to say,
Absolutely.
this is all I can do. Like,
Yeah.
I'm kind of freed of that burden of fixing things. I'm freed of that burden of trying to be happy, right?
Yep.
And just saying, like, it's okay to recognize that I can't do anything about it. Like, focusing on what's right in front of you. There's something joyful about that and consoling, but we have to have a proper...
There's a time to mourn.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet,
Like, that's a gutsy thing
there
to
is-
say, is that there's a time to mourn.
Yeah.
And you know, that peculiar thing that everybody knows is, what are the really joyful times? Usually funerals, you know, I mean, there's always that sadness, but at the same time, depending, you know, like if you're with your family or things. I was thinking about that, we've mentioned Joseph Pieper, the German Thomistic philosopher, and he wrote a book on festivity, and he argues in there that all festivals, if you look at them historically, their roots are, they come from funerals. That festivals are, their source in antiquity came from funerals. So like, for, you know, and so, you know, there you kind of go, like, what? You know, but that joy comes out of this, something really,
Yeah.
there's a certain kind of gravitas there.
Yep.
There's a good Roman word which we didn't talk about.
I
with
know.
Marcus Aurelius, because he really had it, you know, that they're you know, things that are substantial, serious, solid, real, you know, that those are the things that cause us to mourn, but also give us,
Yeah.
strangely enough, joy at the same time,
Yeah.
you know?
Right.
Well, they say there's meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Constance does.
Just hearing y'all talk has kind of brought this to mind, in Ecclesiastes 6:3, it says, a man may beget 100 children and live for many years, but however many are the days of his years, if he does not enjoy life's good things,
Right.
or has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he.
Yeah.
And so, it just makes you know that God isn't using you to try to accomplish His goal.
Right.
His goal is for you to be joyful.
Yep.
And I like that scripture very much.
I do too. Yeah. No, that I think that Ecclesiastes really is about joy, and even it's a very earthy book. It's about the sort of, not the real profound joy that comes from our faith, but real earthy joys of having a spouse and a family and good things to eat and drink and a good job that gives, you know, can't give you ultimate meaning to your life, but gives you a sense of purpose.
Is that like people don't even use the word contentment anymore.
Oh yeah.
But I feel like it's a contentment, like you are content.
That's-
You know, it's not, I'm joyful, lovely,
Right.
you know, whatever, but, you know, I'm content in my life, and this is a good life.
I think about
People
hobbits
hear
when I
the
read
word
Ecclesiastes.
content and think that's bad, like if you say
Yeah.
you're content, that's not good enough.
That's right.
So-
Yeah.
Yeah, not wanting more than what you have, yeah, hobbits.
Yeah, it's a very hobbity book. Yeah, because you have good things to eat and drink and friendship and there's and you don't want more than has been allotted to you, and that's yeah, it's just good plain sense in a way. Yeah.
Well, and that brought to mind to me when this was in St. Anne's Parish, but they had a youth group and a youth leader there, and they would take trips where in the summer, you know, the kids would sign up for it, the teenagers if they wanted to go. And of course, there was a fee and all of that to help with the cost of the travels. But they would go to a community and that needed help, and just, you know, go out and do physical things that for these people. And I remember my son coming back from that and saying, these people have nothing,
Yeah.
but they were so gracious to us.
Yeah.
and they just did everything they could for us to feed us, and it was just the basics, but still they were so willing to share with us. And he says, I was just amazed at them.
Yeah.
And that's, it was a good lesson for him to learn, for life. But that not that you have to constantly be, not that you have to be on top of the world, so to speak, as we think of it, but to just be happy where you are.
Right.
And they were thankful. These kids were coming and building and painting and doing whatever, for them. But they didn't, but they were so willing to recoup, give back to them.
So in a way, you kind of have Solomon in the background saying, "I've tried this." He has this, to borrow a line from Macbeth, this vain ambition. Vain ambition. Ultimately empty. Like he's going to learn more than anybody else. He's going to have more riches than anyone else. All of these things, it's kind of like his life is a laboratory in a way. And he finds that real joy and contentment comes from the ordinary pleasures in life. Not these being on top of the world, but the things that, he's the king, he has access to everything. And in a way, it's almost like he kind of envies his subjects, in a manner of speaking, because they have it all, because they don't have as much as he does. I think that's part of what's going on here. It's a complicated book, but that for sure is part of what is going on there. Yeah. Before we go out and break, I just want to let's talk a little bit about the central themes of the book. So there are 3 passages where these, in 6:3, kind of parallels one of these. It's not one of the verses I picked out, but it echoes. So there are 3 places where you have a certain phrase shows up, and then the rest of the book is just kind of echoing it over and over again. So let's start in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 24. This is the first time it shows up. So he says, "There's nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and provide themselves with good things from their toil. Even this I saw is from the hand of God." This is one of the reasons that the Germans thought this must have been written by an Epicurean. Eat, drink, be merry. As though it's something about pleasure. And it's not talking about pleasure really, though. It's really talking about joy on an earthly plane. But
Northern
joy.
Germans wouldn't have liked that. Southern Germans would have maybe been.
Yeah, the Bavarians.
Northern.
Yeah, you're right. And then moving on to the next chapter. So after the famous poem, so verse 12, verses 12 and 13. "I recognize that there is nothing better than to rejoice and to do well during life. Moreover, that all can eat and drink and enjoy the good of all their toil. This is a gift of God." And over again, it's interesting, he says that to eat and to drink and to be merry is a gift from God. It's a good thing. He recognizes the goodness of created pleasures. And then the last place that shows up is towards the end in chapter 9, verses 7 through 10. And in a way, there's a lot that follows this, but this in a way I think is his last word before a sober reminder of old age and death. "So go eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart, because it is now that God favors your works. At all times let your garments be white, and spare not the perfume for your head. Enjoy life with the wife you love, all the days of the vain life granted you under the sun. This is your lot in life for the toil of your labors under the sun." That was chapter 9, verses 7 through, let's go ahead and read the last verse, sorry, and verse through 10. Anything you can turn your hand to, do with what power you have. For there will be no work, no planning, no knowledge, no wisdom in Sheol, where you are going. So there you have that, the agnosticism there, but still this, God's given you this. This is something we know about. These good things you have here, those come from God, and so don't waste them. Enjoy them while you have them. You want to? Oh, sorry, you had something.
Yeah. No, that's a good place to break, and then maybe, because as you say those, and I think kind of coming back to that idea of the first time you read this, you can pluck out a few things that you think are the things of the book, but then you see that it's so much more nuanced than that, and that it's like and I hear people quote this a lot with ideas, so that, there's nothing new under the sun. And so, like, people will use that, not necessarily in a wrong way, but just kind of like, well, that's not really a new idea, there's nothing new under the sun. Like, I've heard people do that in theology, and kind of suggesting that this idea that, like, we don't really learn anything new, it's already been said, but...
If it is new, it's probably a heresy.
Right, yeah, and things like that. And there's a lot of truth to that in a certain sense. But that, if you really believe that, you also have to believe that then there's kind of a building of knowledge through history. So if nothing's new under the sun because it's already been given to us, well, that means that at some point it had to have been written down, or, there had to be, so you can't take that to its extreme. You can't, it almost sounds postmodern to me in the sense of, like, we've already gone through this, we've tried to figure things out, and now I just realized we can't know anything. People try to quote this in a postmodern sense sometimes, of that, like, human reason can't really do anything, so all we can do is say, like, I don't know how any of this works, period, kind of giving me an excuse not to delve into it. So the irony is that the author of this is talking about the futility of all these pursuits, but he's also affirming that it's worthwhile, right? So he's, like, he wouldn't be writing a book of these reflections if he didn't think it was worthwhile to reflect, is, I guess, my point. So he's not saying that,
right,
so there's some irony there, is that, we can't figure this out, we can't really find wisdom, but he's pointing to the fact that there is a kind of wisdom that's worth having and worth pursuing, or else he wouldn't be reflecting on that.
But he's also, this book is not useful for modernists. It's more useful for postmodernists, in that he affirms that knowledge is not an absolute good.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's why, so we talked about how popular Stoicism is right now last week. Ecclesiastes, in the last century especially, was wildly popular among non-religious people. And I think that has to do with, think about the birds, right? But I think that has to do with the postmodern sentiment in the culture, and this, it does kind of line up with some of that. But you're right. He's not saying that there's no use then to thinking about things. He's just saying that don't put all your eggs in that basket, because you're going to be disappointed. Yeah.
He's like, I don't want to say contradictory, but it's like he's kind of setting boundaries. But by setting those boundaries, he's affirming that there's something good there. Even so, he's saying that all this work and toil is futile, and especially I'm thinking of this reading, and I know we'll talk about that later, but that it's attributed to Solomon, so we can talk about kind of the history there. But it's like, at once, all of this work is useless, but also that's what allows you to enjoy the fruits of your, so it's like there's a particular kind of man who can enjoy the works, but the wicked man can't.
That's
right. So what I see juxtaposed throughout the book is that the wicked man, this is what happens to the wicked man, but the righteous man, and I know he doesn't use that term, I don't think, but that there's a certain type of work, there's a certain type of knowledge, there's a certain type of joy that does last. He doesn't really outline a program to find that, but that's kind of seems to be what he's getting at to me.
But don't be too righteous, he says.
Right, yeah. So again, it's like, and even that, and I'm thinking of Marcus Aurelius a little bit too, of that it's vain to pursue wisdom, some kinds of wisdom, but obviously there's a pursuit of a wisdom that lasts too, so.
And throughout the text, I noticed another theme I was surprised that it didn't come up was so often he mentions mentions vanity and chasing the wind, I thought that was over.
Mhm.
Because he would build up a theme about something very wonderful and good,
Yeah.
and say, this is only vanity. And it's
He
just
kind of
vanity."
deflates it, doesn't he?
Mhm.
Yes.
And it's like,
Yeah.
what? You know,
Yeah.
how can that be possible?
But we have to talk about vanity later, the problem with that word. Yep.
And another question, one more.
Sure.
How does this get recognized as in the canon, and the protelium of St. James is not?
Oh,
Is that?
we can talk about that some other time.
I didn't understand that either when I was reading this, because that came to my mind. Like, how did this get in there and not that?
Because this is in our canon because the Jewish people accepted it, even though they debate about it after, but it's in every copy of the Septuagint that the early church is using, so it's already there.
That's explained, thank you.
Yeah.
Just didn't get that part.
And like the Protevangelium of James, which is beautiful, but it's too late
Ah, okay, that makes sense.
and probably not
That
completely
makes sense.
historical.
Thank you. Now I get
Yeah.
it.
So,
Should we take a break?
thought we would do discussion groups again. And what I thought we might do, so I wrote a passage from the Gospels on the board. This is the parable of the rich fool. The parable of the rich fool.
Oh, okay, right.
And so if you'll read that, here's your assignment. The rich fool quotes Ecclesiastes. And so your task is to try and square Ecclesiastes with Luke 12. How do these, both of these are inspired scripture, so how can they both be in the Bible as the inspired word of God? So that's your challenge. Is one. Well, I do think that there, like in this progressive revelation sense, yeah, the gospel certainly has priority, but is it, I guess that's the question, is it canceling it out, or is it, what's going on here? So you can read it by yourself, or you can read it in groups, and then find some people to discuss that with.
And did you use all of Ecclesiastes, or Ecclesiastes?
Well, those three passages in particular, so that was part of the reason I wanted to do that before we broke, is to have, so in those three passages we see the central theme of eat, drink, and be merry. And Luke 12 has something else to say about that. So how do you, if that's the theme of Ecclesiastes,
All right.
what do we do with this? I didn't think to look at the. Did you find anything interesting in there?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So, I grew up in Oklahoma, and as a Catholic, and I had never heard of the Protestant work ethic.
Oh.
And so then when I get older and I hear about this word, I realize I've never lived according to this. And I think that's what the scripture's saying, that I will pull down my barns and build larger ones. That's really in opposition to saying to my soul, you have ample goods. So there's a contradiction there. Ecclesiastes is correct. You should eat, drink, and be merry, but not pull down the barns and build larger ones. That's.
Okay.
Don't be greedy.
So talk about
Yeah,
this.
yeah, greedy.
So find a group. I think Constance is onto something here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did not write it.
Yeah, she's still.
The,
Don't need to discuss.
No, I think there's still.
seems like the several fathers, I thought was interesting, they like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, is there like a natural pairing to those, or is it just like random that it's in that order? It seemed like several of the fathers pointed out that those two really went together, and that
There are
But like a progression
There are
between those
proverbs
two.
in Ecclesiastes.
that
Well,
like,
like some of the things you mentioned, nothing new under the sun. That's
yeah,
kind of a proverb. Our idea about the fly in the night.
because Origen, at least, and I think Gregory of Nyssa talked about that, and even the significance of like Proverbs was the king. The author was identified as the king of Israel, and then they were a couple of them were all over that Proverbs was the king of Israel, but Ecclesiastes was the king of Israel in Jerusalem, and that again with that kind of spiritual interpretation, where they're getting, but they were like that was a big deal, that they were saying that like Proverbs was like almost it was more of like a general, like more practical type of guide, that this is for people that have faith, and so just follow these proverbs. But that the fact that he was identifying himself as the king of Jerusalem was like this more spiritual. I guess that was, they were trying to make a distinction of like that Ecclesiastes was more spiritual. I had the quote here somewhere. Okay, here's Origen says, in the first book, Proverbs, when he establishes us by moral instructions, he is said to be king of Israel, but not yet in Jerusalem. Because although we are called Israel because of faith, that does not yet mark an attainment by which we should appear to have arrived at the heavenly Jerusalem.
Oh, wow.
But when we have made enough progress for it to come to pass that we are brought into fellowship with the church of the firstborn, which is in heaven, and known by previous careful consideration and by natural reasons, that the heavenly Jerusalem is our mother. I thought that was interesting. And it made me ask the question is, do you see either of you see any kind of like Platonism going on here? At least an idea, I'm not saying it was like borrowed from, but it seems like you could read it with a kind of a two-tiered view of the cosmos almost, that like, there's that what we're experiencing here is a shadowy representation of the true life. I mean, and that's again that's not an unchristian idea.
I don't think that's in Ecclesiastes itself. I think that's a good reading of. I think that's how Origen would read it.
Yeah,
maybe.
I guess that's. Yeah, I guess I'm just.
Yeah, I think that's a valid reading of it, but I don't feel like that's the perspective of the author.
Origen was what, 2nd century AD? Is that right?
Third. I think he was born maybe in the late 2nd century.
Gregory of Nyssa says the thoughts of Proverbs have already prepared the mind by exercise. So like kind of like you should read Proverbs before you read Ecclesiastes.
Interesting.
The thoughts of Proverbs have already prepared the mind by exercise. I'm omitting a little bit here. Then for those who have developed to the more advanced stages of learning, there comes the ascent towards this truly sublime and God-inspired work of Scripture.
Because they have a very high regard for it. But do they say why they like it so much? What?
Let me see. I can't remember. If then the exercise and expressions which prepares us for these lessons. Oh yeah, this is interesting. If this exercise is so painful and difficult to understand, how great an effort must be envisaged in these lofty thoughts which now lie before us for interpretation. So even the language, and again, I don't know what term he would have been using in I guess Greek is what he would have been writing in, but the ascent and kind of even this idea of purification, that there's a growing, and so I'm even thinking of analogies for like John of the Cross, or the idea that there's like a purgation, and even they use that language that you have to suffer, and like what we were talking about with chapter 1, chapter 118, for in much wisdom there is much sorrow, and he who stores up knowledge stores up grief. It's like what you were saying about the author, that he was clearly a person who suffered. There seems to be an ingredient in there that like you have to suffer, that there's a purgation, there's kind of a purification through suffering, that you're really ascending in your relationship, so that like Proverbs is pain, like it's, so I guess the analogy I was in my mind was kind of like the three stages of the interior life, like the purgation, like we have to like live our life right first. So there's kind of like a natural purgation. You have to get disattached from sin, but then there's also this kind of spiritual purgation where we have to suffer to get in union with God. So it's like maybe I'm just reading that anachronistically, but it's almost like that's what he's hinting at. Is that there's
Well, I would totally agree with him that Ecclesiastes is on another line from Proverbs. Yeah, they're both beautiful books. Proverbs is in some ways an easier book, more accessible.
yeah.
But
And then I was interested in that book. There were some quotes from Augustine too, and maybe I was just interested because it kind of plugs it in. I'm kind of attuned to the way Augustine thinks, and it seems to make sense to me. And so Augustine was interested in that, that discussion of vanity. And so for Augustine, it was more that things were vain when we pursued them in a disordered way, right? So it's just that discussion of that, like he's not saying that, and by those three verses you pointed out, I think did that for us, is saying that like these things are good. And so Augustine just goes into that a little more deeply, is that wine is not bad, it's vanity. And so like every time all the things he lists as being vain, what he's really saying is these are good things, but they're vain when we pursue them disorderly. But I mean, that's kind of Augustine's outlook on a lot of things.
we can start. That is interesting. He's also thinking about Manichaeans.
Yeah.
When he's saying that
Right.
sort of thing.
That part of it doesn't make sense to me.
So they're being reprimanded here by God for
He's comparing a lion to a dog. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. A live dog is pretty wrong.
So was your
Okay.
trip planned, or was everything going okay?
Yeah, no, things are really, he's doing really well. As a matter of fact, they're talking now, they're going to dismiss him from the hospital on Thursday. So we brought so the reason we went up there is because we brought the other two kids home, because right then, when they bring John Francis out of the hospital, they'll stay at the Ron McGowan house for a little while, but they have to find an apartment in downtown Chicago, which is going to be that's going to be a challenge. But anyway, it was just like, he has to really kind of keep him away from germs. So the idea would be like,
And maybe it's merely,
Yeah.
the fewer people he's around, the better. So they're gonna, the other two are gonna stay at our house for about a month, and then we're gonna go back up and who knows what's gonna happen.
So he's got to stay close for his ongoing.
Yeah, so so he has to stay close to. He has to be within 5 miles of the hospital. He'll have to have weekly checkups, and then if anything goes wrong, they'll be nearby. But he was up, and we were up there yesterday at the hospital, and he was walking. He gets out of bed now. He's walking, and
I don't think he's going to an addiction. In other words,
Is he being constantly, is he still hooked up with stuff monitoring, or not really?
yeah, he's got a couple monitors on, and he's got one line in, mostly for brain, because he's got this incision from the top, right from here all the way down to about here, staples and stuff. And he's looking, What he's doing, guys.
All right.
You know, he was in a good mood yesterday.
We'll come back together then.
So, things are kind of,
Yes, if you were.
Jane was gonna be up there longer, but then we thought, heck, why don't we just bring the kids back? I don't know, we're trying to figure it out.
And were you two up here?
You know.
Yeah, we
All right, so maybe we'll just do that and go.
But then Jane got the bright
This
idea,
way.
hey, why don't we just try and
All
go
right.
during the night, because then the kids will sleep in the car, which is true. You know, but it's like, well, and every, they had
Okay.
3 adults in the car, because my son.
Okay.
was also-
Okay.
But even then, it's just like, I can't sleep in the car. I mean,
So we'll start with these two ladies up here in the front. So what were your thoughts?
Okay, in Luke, the rich fool, he's greedy, he's really greedy, and not thankful to God, But in Ecclesiastes,
Mm-hmm.
like, there's like chapter 3, verse 12, it says, I recognize that there's nothing better than to be glad and to do well during life. For every man, moreover, to eat, drink, and enjoy the fruit of all his labor is a gift of God. So in Ecclesiastes, at least it always says, eat, drink, be merry, because God has gifted you.
Yeah.
God has been good to you.
There's this, this sense of gratitude.
A sense of gratitude. And I mean, it's almost
Yeah.
in every one of those.
Yes, it is.
In 3 and 9, and then in 5:17 through 9,
Yeah.
there's 5:17 through 9, there's the same thing too.
Yes, that's right. There it's specifically talking about riches. Verse 18, those to whom God gives riches and property, and grant. So there's your farmer,
Uh-huh.
your rich farmer, and grants power to partake of them, so that they receive their lot and find joy in the fruits of their toil. This is a gift from God. Yeah.
So Ecclesiastes, at least it is thankful
Yes.
to God,
That's right.
versus the,
That's very good. Yeah, I think we haven't mentioned gratitude, but gratitude certainly is another theme in Ecclesiastes. I don't think it uses the word thanks anywhere, but there's certainly an atmosphere that infuses the whole thing. Absolutely, very good.
okay.
You know, what about this group in the back there?
Well, Caroline had the neat idea that the fool is doing what Solomon had done before.
Yes.
He's building and building, and Solomon had done that, and then realizes that isn't going to do any good.
That's right.
So that they're actually, and then the fool is not going to have the chance, and the fool is not going to have the chance to come to that realization.
That's right.
Because his life is going to be called
Yeah.
that day.
So the fool, this is it's kind of a joke. Jesus is kind of telling a joke here, I think. So he tells a story where the guy quotes Ecclesiastes, but it's obvious he doesn't really understand Ecclesiastes. He doesn't understand that just amassing all of this isn't the point, and he doesn't understand that life is really short and fickle, and that you can't make these plans as though they're set in stone and you are the Lord of the universe.
How to make God laugh.
That's right.
Tell him your plan.
That's right. That's right. Well, yeah, God mocks him in the end.
Yeah.
You fool. Yeah. So, what about this side? Oh.
Come on, baby.
No, I can't either.
I don't know where we got, because we got kind of separated off, I don't know what's happening.
He's running prison report.
And I suppose he's blaming us girls.
It was was a contradiction of Ecclesiastes.
That's right.
And now that I've got Amy to commit to that, I'm abandoning that position.
a trap.
That,
Nice.
that the parable is almost a cartoon
Yes.
of the good outline in Ecclesiastes. It is, this is a good thing, but you in becoming preoccupied, and I did use the word preoccupied,
Yep.
Amy. Preoccupied, that you have perverted the good
Right.
of Ecclesiastes. And it's almost a cartoon story.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, this guy's a fool.
Most of the parables are, really.
Well,
Yeah.
and to illustrate. So
Yeah.
I now think it doesn't contradict Ecclesiastes, but well, shades it, I mean,
Yep.
it illustrates it.
Yeah. So one of the things when you're comparing Old Testament and New Testament passages, Jesus in particular, he quotes the Old Testament all the time, and sometimes he quotes them in a way that's provocative, and it sounds as though he's dismissing it. The Sermon on the Mount is a clear example of this, where he says, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." And all but one of those places, he's making a direct quote from the Torah. And it sounds as though he's saying, "You've heard this in the Torah, but we don't need that. Here's mine." But if you read the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "I didn't come to get rid of Torah." So that can't be what he's doing. But he quotes scriptures, and then he challenges, I think he's actually challenging the way those scriptures are being used in the community.
Being lived out.
Or being quoted. Because there was a habit, I think there's still a habit, of reducing these to kind of mottos or bumper stickers and not thinking beyond that particular text. So for instance, Deuteronomy has all of this, basically if you read Deuteronomy and you don't reflect on it, it says good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And people had based this huge theology of reward and merit, and so that's why his disciples, when they encounter the blind person, they say, "Who sinned that this man is born blind, him or his parents?" And Jesus says, "No, this happened for the glory of God." Well, at first it sounds like he's setting aside Deuteronomy. From their perspective, it might have sounded that way. And yet, if you read the Gospels carefully, he quotes Deuteronomy all the time. I think Deuteronomy is his favorite book, actually. But he doesn't want people to misuse the Bible, so he'll quote the Bible in these kind of provocative ways to challenge their kind of surface level understanding of it.
There's one more parallel that we found, Ecclesiastes, chapter 2, verse 25, "For who can eat or drink apart from God?" And then here,
Yeah.
we have, and it's actually was explained in the footnote, 12:21, "Rich in what matters to God," as it's worded in Luke, literally rich for God. So there's a message there to amass what you have, whatever it is, even if, whether you're rich or poor, it's to God. Those are the
Yes.
two parallels that I'm seeing there.
Yeah. Yeah. You could use Ecclesiastes to support kind of a gross materialism, and Jesus is challenging that in Luke 12, but he's not denying. I think we were talking over the break about, as we were reflecting this morning, I was thinking, well, Jesus sounds a lot like Ecclesiastes in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, when you fast, wash your face and anoint your head. I think Jesus actually is very much in harmony with Ecclesiastes, but he's wanting to discipline the way we think about these things. Yeah.
Well, the whole time you've kind of been mentioning Ecclesiastes as like the beginning of the progression.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when I read the parable, in my mind, I just went to, okay, well, this is where we're supposed to go.
Yeah.
Because we don't just eat, drink, and be merry, and that's it. You know,
Right.
we have to be preparing ourselves for death. Because,
That's right.
you said this is very agnostic, they're not even worried about really the afterlife yet. So, well, I mean,
Yeah,
he doesn't really mention
yeah,
that, or being concerned about heaven or,
yeah. He's not. He's. When I say he's agnostic, it's not that he doesn't care. It's that you don't know,
right,
and so you can't. From the author's, from Ecclesiastes' perspective,
right, yeah.
making plans for the afterlife is just kind of a fool's errand,
Right, but then
because
obviously
you just
in the
don't
New
know what's going to
Testament,
happen then.
we know.
Right. You're exactly right. So yeah, no, that's actually a keen insight. So Jesus is saying, you actually better be. I mean, he says it elsewhere, right? Lay up treasures in heaven, not here on earth. So yeah,
And being rich can oftentimes really distract you from God, I
Yeah.
think there's definitely that's been down, but even more so today because everything says go buy stuff, you have to have at least 2 cars, you have to have at least 3 TVs, you have to have this in our
Yeah.
society to be, okay, and we
Yep.
don't really have to have all that.
Yep.
So, it's hard to remind yourself of that, and I think we get very, very caught up in that whole, this is our kind of cultural norm,
Yeah.
that we forget that, I think the riches a lot of times distract us from
yeah,
what's very important, so. I have a friend who doesn't have a TV, who lives in this tiny little place, and, I mean, every day he's so joyful, thankful to God, it just reminds me of, I guess, that riches are really not what it's all about. And that's,
Yeah.
I think that's really a strong message in both of these things.
You mentioned his agnosticism of not knowing, and that because he doesn't know what's next, and presumably because he doesn't know what's going to advance him towards a good reward, he kind of settles on this enjoyment. And so and I can't remember, I think it came up last week, we were talking about the famous Pascal's wager, this idea that if you don't know, then you should certainly place your bet on eternal life. And so I think in a kind of a post-Reformation sense, Christians opt for the idea that you ought to go without lots of pleasures for the hope of eternal life, but this is reflecting something that predates that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's based on, like you mentioned, Deuteronomy, it's based on this understanding that, generally speaking, good things are from God.
Yep.
So with that mindset, it's easier to enjoy good things if that's where you're assuming they come from. With good intentions, I think in a modern sense, we get very confused by that because we kind of,
Right.
and because of, we're cognizant of original sin, we're cognizant of the temptations of the flesh, so we kind of don't trust our senses, and so we kind of say well, there almost seems something wrong about saying we'll eat, drink, and be merry. We're not necessarily comfortable with that because we don't think we have permission to do that.
Yeah.
But so that the fact that he's not sure, so he's settling on you should enjoy. I'm not sure if most post-Reformation Christians would have the same, in their unsurety, would have their same confidence in the good things that God's given to us.
But it's a little more complicated than that, I think. Okay, so I'm trying. Remind me of your name. Sorry. Caroline? Caroline. Okay, Caroline. So Carolyn was talking to me over the break about what would St. Anthony of the Desert think of Ecclesiastes. And I do think that our relationship to this is different in the Christian revelation in the sense that we have this ascetical element. The Jewish people, they know asceticism as well, but it's a different kind. It's not as dialed up as it is. So you have certain days of fasting, and when they fast, they really fast. But you wouldn't just fast normally. It would be for certain days, or maybe for a certain situation that you would want to turn to God in prayer in a special way. but you wouldn't like give up pleasures normally. That wouldn't make sense. You certainly would not go without marriage. And that's the first commandment, to be fruitful and multiply. And so to give up marriage and family life, they don't understand those sorts of sacrifices. And Jesus comes and he says, he doesn't say those things are bad, but he says there might be something better that's worth giving those up for. And I think that does change our relationship to Ecclesiastes too. Now, that gets a little wonky after the Reformation, but I think some of what you're talking about is actually in a part of the Christian revelation as a whole. Our misgivings about this come from what we know of what Jesus and the apostles have told us about our relationship with material goods.
I agree. Well, you mentioned the purpose for the sacrifice, right? So asceticism
that's right.
is a setting aside for a purpose, and I think, doesn't Lewis write, I think it's one of his essays, or maybe it's from one of his books, but talking about our modern tendency to sacrifice, like for the sake of only sacrifice. Anybody remember that? I think it's C.S. Lewis and that's basically was his point, is that like
Kind of like the Puritan sort of.
that's what he's getting at, is the idea that like the reason that we would forego something is because we're recognizing that it's good, and there's a purpose for setting it aside. It's not a setting aside something because we think it's tainted or something. And I think that's, like, as I was reading this, that kept coming to my mind, of that, just the interconnectivity of things. And so, like, before the break and in the small group discussions, you were all talking about this idea that you have to recognize that a good thing comes from God. Well, that's a leap that a lot of people, particularly in a secular sense, aren't able to make. And so in a Catholic sense, like, we see this connectivity between the good things that we experience, whether it's food or drink or family life or whatever it is, we see that they're connected to God, whereas but that takes an integrated understanding of the world. And so kind of the if I can use the general term modern again, kind of this fractured understanding of the world we have now leads us to that we don't understand how a good thing, so we either think a good thing is good because of itself, so we want to build bigger barns and get more of it, or we just see it as isolated, being a pleasure that's isolated from any sort of goodness. So it's like we either want to hoard or reject. We don't have a balance there.
That's true. Oh yeah.
And so it's like there's, and even there, it seems like throughout the book, to me, the big picture is that he's getting at a singularity in all of these things. And even one of the commentaries I was meaning, which I hadn't caught it, and maybe he made too much of it, but in chapter 2, when he's, chapter 3, I'll get there eventually. The air conditioner the AC keeps moving my pages over. Chapter 3, I think, is the one, when it's, starts out, there's an appointed time for everything. Well, there happens to be 7 things listed here, and so when this commentary was saying that that the author is trying to sanctify, to show this complete unit of life, that it's not just individually that we kind of balance these things, but that it's as a whole. And so, like, if you go through all these things, this is a picture of a full life. And so the message, all of life is good. So it's sanctifying all of our time. And I think with the pursuit of goods, and so we were talking about, hobbits, or Anne Marie, I think you were talking about just the idea of contentment. In some of the ancient commentaries that I was looking at, several of the fathers of the church were interested in that vanity seems to come from a disordered pursuit of things, that the things we're pursuing are not bad, but it's a disordered pursuit of there. And then, like Augustine is always, pretty much everything that Augustine writes, at least to me, seems like he always comes back to original sin. For most of his points, it's always like, let's look at what happened for original sin, right? And so that's how.
It's not a bad approach.
I know it seems to work pretty well.
Very revealing, actually.
It works for me. I don't know about you guys, but But, so he talks about even the, and again, using the spiritual sense of Scripture, he unpacks a lot from those first 3 chapters of Genesis. But, he talks about the idea that our needs are more simple before the fall, right? So before the fall, we don't need very much. And we're happy with very little, comparatively speaking, or at least when it comes to the number of things.
Socrates' City of Pigs.
Okay.
In the Republic, right? He talks about like an ideal society, we would live like pigs.
Live like pigs. Okay.
Not in the sense of, but that we wouldn't need a city.
Things.
We wouldn't need a government. We would just have, eat when we want to eat, sleep when we want to sleep.
Right. So yeah, that's the same kind of idea here. But so with sin, then we have more things. Now we need to work. Now life gets more complex, and so to him, and his idea on Ecclesiastes is that the author's kind of referring us back to that, is that with more needs and with more desires, now we suffer more, and now we think things are vain because we're pursuing lots of things rather than the one thing. Or like I'm thinking of Martha and Mary, kind of that dialogue between Jesus, the pursuit of the one thing. And if you allow me, I just want to read a couple of lines. This is from Gregory of Nyssa, from his homilies on Ecclesiastes. He's commenting on chapter, I'll just go through them one by one until I find it. Chapter 1. Chapter 1, verse 7, where it says, "All rivers go to the sea, yet never does the sea become full. To the place where they go, the rivers keep on going." And perhaps one way to read that is kind of a defeatist view that, wow, this is an example of nothing ever seems to get done. The rivers are always draining, the sea never doesn't seem to really change. What's the point? But that's not the full sense, and certainly Gregory of Nyssa didn't think that was the full sense. He had a much more hopeful view of that, and this is what he says. He says, "The sea does not exceed its boundary with the innumerable streams of water flowing into it, but remains at the same volume, just as though it were receiving no new water from the streams. In the same way, human nature, too, restrained by specific limits in the enjoyment of what comes to it, cannot enlarge its appetite to match the extent of its acquisitions. While the intake is endless, the capacity for enjoyment is kept within its set limit."
Oh, wow.
That's a different insight, is that in that sense, the sea is content. It's not that, the sea never gets full. It's that that's what the sea needs. The work of the rivers also is not fruitless. The work of the rivers is then validated too. So there's this kind of harmonious relationship. And so comparing that with human nature, for Gregory of Nyssa, that's a very hopeful, that's a view of contentment, is that it's not vanity in the sense of we shouldn't pursue any of these things, but the chasing after wind is the over pursuit, or it's the disordered pursuit or whatnot. Stephanie?
Well, when you were talking about, not building up and before the fall, remember C.S. Lewis in the Paralandra, Ransom is enjoying the fruit on one of the floating islands, and he has a thought that maybe I should save some. I could gather it up. And then he realizes, I don't need to. It'll be here tomorrow. I don't need to do it. Because he is in a world before the fall. Therefore, he doesn't have to have that hoarding and gathering. There's no reason to.
That's a great point.
There may be better fruit.
Right.
We'll find tomorrow.
That's it.
So,
I had a thought on what you were saying about the rivers and the sea. And the river has a beginning somewhere. And it has an end. It has a journey that it is going on. And so do we. But, and to me, it was, the thought that came to me was, well, the sea is heaven. And no matter how many of us, if we follow that journey that God has put us on, and we're heading to heaven, it's never going to be too full for us. There always will be a place for us in its boundaries.
all rivers flow to the sea. So, so one of the things, briefly, and then we'll maybe take another break, and then we can talk about some of the passages that are a little, maybe more perplexing. But one of the things we've mentioned vanity now, and I think that word is difficult for us to really appreciate. So Saint Jerome got us started with vanitas, vain. Everything is a vanity. But in the Hebrew, the word is hevel, and it's hard to translate hevel, but there's kind of a real concrete example of something being hevel, empty, vain, and I don't even think that's really a good translation. There's a guy named Hevel in the Bible. You know him as Abel. And the reason Abel is given the name Hevel isn't because he's empty or meaningless. It's because he's only around for a short amount of time before Cain snuffs his life out. So the word that's translated vanity could be translated, I think, ephemeral. Something fleeting, passing by. Everything, it slips through our hands. We can't grasp onto it. And so, like, when you read this, he's saying vanity of vanities. He may actually be saying everything is slipping by. You can't store things up the way you want to. And that's the next verse, verse 3. What profit have we from all the toil which we toil at under the sun? The word that's translated there, profit, in Hebrew, I would say it's excess. It's like stored up. And he's saying you can't really store up the things that make life meaningful. So you can enjoy them, but you can't. But you enjoy them in the moment, and then they pass by.
You know, I was thinking about going back to eating and drinking. I mean, in the ancient world, you know, eating and drinking was necessarily a communal thing.
Right.
You know, and I think we've kind of lost that idea to a certain extent, that we think of as just gratifying our appetites, where that actually was, it was an opportunity for relationship. You know, you see that in the Greeks. I don't know if it was so much, I don't know what it was like, you know, for the Jewish people, but, you know, like if you broke bread with somebody, a stranger, you entered into a relationship, a bond that would last for generations. You know, you see that in Homer all the time, you know, you know, when a stranger comes to your door and you feed them, you're not just like gratifying their appetite, you're actually accepting this person into a network of friendship and also kind of a reciprocal obligation, you know.
That still very much exists in Middle Eastern cultures.
Yep.
Yeah, I was gonna
My
say.
husband was deployed 5 times, and so to do anything, you have to go in, you have to sit down, you have to eat lamb's eyes, you have to do all this stuff before they even talk to you. Like, they're not even going to talk to you.
Yep.
So you have to go in and create this, on our side, this false relationship. You know, but you have
Pretend to be their
it.
friend.
And also on their side, probably a little bit, this false relationship. But it still has to be there, or there will be no conversation.
Oh yeah. No, it's very much the same in Jewish culture. So when you hear eat, drink, and be merry, they're not talking about like going to McDonald's and like, you know, they're talking about a social event. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but you know, you can't read. No, you can go to McDonald's and get, you know, a big boy, or what do they call that? Whatever they
Big
hamburger.
Mac.
Big Mac. I never go, so.
You just endeared yourself to me more than that's okay. That's great.
You can do that every day, you know.
Yeah.
But like when someone comes to your door and you break bread with them, that you can't recreate
That's right.
that. So that's something that you can't hoard that up.
That's right.
That's a gift, you know. And so when we're talking about this kind of giftedness about this element, I think we have to kind of keep that in perspective.
So he's not saying that. So some translations they'll say meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. I think the NIV says that. That's a terrible translation. He's not saying that things don't have meaning. He's not even saying that they're so here, our wonderful New American Bible that our bishops have given us, in the footnotes.
Plus, they have the copyright, so they're making money.
I know,
Okay,
I know. So here it
I didn't know
says,
you liked it so much.
it says a Hebrew superlative, vanity of vanities, a Hebrew superlative expressing the supreme degree of futility and emptiness. No, that's not the sentiment at all. He's just saying you can't hang on to it. You can enjoy it. He's not saying it's futile. He's not saying that it is empty of meaning, devoid of meaning. He's saying that it's not something concrete that you can store up. It slips away.
Monsignor Ronald Knox translates it, a shadow, he tells us, a shadow, a world of shadows.
I like that better. That's, yeah. And he's translating from the Vulgate. That's,
Yeah.
but I know the Vulgate has...
No, he's translating. I thought he was translating from.
No, he's translating from the Vulgate, and then
Is he?
he supplements with the Masoretic and Hebrew. He
Yeah,
fills in gaps, but
Okay.
he's using Jerome.
yeah. But Jerome, I know, does have vanitas there.
But he
So
translates
that's
it.
interesting. No, I like that very much. I think that's that catches it better than meaningless for sure, and I think even better than vanity, really.
Howard, you mentioned the importance of meals and fellowship, and I'm trying to think, several of you were reading the Count of Monte Cristo and on our good books, book studies, and in the section that we just read recently, there was a scene where the Count is being entertained by Mercedes, and if you know the story, I won't go all into it, but he won't eat anything, is the point. He won't taste even the smallest morsel, and Mercedes picks up on it because she's watching. I mean, she's like following him around, like, okay, go offer him a peach, and somebody goes, and he won't take it, and so like she's trying to set him up, and then she confronts him, and she says, well, there's an old Arab custom that if you've eaten bread and salt with someone,
Yeah.
then that means you've made a lasting pact. And that's mentioned several times in Scripture, like in Acts chapter 1, which our NIV doesn't retain salt. It just says he ate with them.
Right.
But if I'm not mistaken, the Greek word, I won't even try to pronounce it, but it's salt, senelmentos. It's from, I'm picking this up from Benedict XVI's commentary on it. But anyways, that it says Jesus ate bread and salt with the disciples after the resurrection, before the ascension. And according to Joseph Ratzinger, there were a couple of key times, which I didn't look them up, but from the Old Testament, where salt was mentioned as being that which was consumed. One was from the book of Numbers, and I can't remember what the other one was.
And
The
Lot's
priest-
wife, don't forget about that.
That's right.
Speaking of salt, yeah.
No, God has a covenant of salt with the Levites,
Okay.
meaning that they're able to eat the sacrifices that come from the altar.
Okay.
So they have like this table fellowship with God in a way.
So so I guess going back to the idea of things are fleeting, it's like in all of these basic human things, we have this desire that they'll last,
Yeah.
right? That even, so,
And in the Lord's Prayer, our Lord says, give us this day our daily bread.
right.
Day is mentioned twice.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing that's stored up, it's what I.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wow.
Day or
It's like
daily.
the man in the desert.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
It's the
you.
only snack food there was in the whole.
But
When you think about it, though, in any time but ours, you had to go out and kill something before you could eat, and it wasn't for one. You know?
That's right.
Heifer for one, Joe?
No, that's certainly true. And it was almost always ritually killed as a sacrifice too. You would eat meat very, very infrequently, and it was usually kind of a holiday situation. You'd call the whole family together, and that was when you got your meat for the year. So yeah,
Well, but everything had to be done that way. You didn't
Yep.
go to Dillon's and pick up a
That's
package
right.
of it. So naturally, it would be, hey, if we're gonna eat, there's a process.
That's
And
right.
it's part of what we are,
Yeah,
that we completely lack for. And
yeah. You gonna take a break or?
Let's see, I guess we've been going almost an hour. Closing thoughts or questions before we take a final break?
Enjoy life.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, that was the constant, we'll do it tomorrow. Like, it's so foreign to us as Americans.
And frustrating.
And frustrating. Because Connie brings up the Protestant work ethic that
Yeah.
is totally ingrained in us. And so, the Americans trying to live over there, hey,
Yeah.
let's get it done. But it's so much cultural, because I mean, they don't really have a faith anymore, but it has stuck to their culture. They
Yeah.
definitely have not let go of that. And the Italian friends that we made are, they were always so welcoming, and, it
Yep.
was part of, coming together and having a meal and all that
Yeah.
stuff. And really enjoying one another's company. It's something that we try to do over here, but it's very different.
Yeah. Israelis, they would drive us nuts because they were so social. So like, my wife and I are both a little antisocial. You might not know it, but I can remember one time we went to, someone gave us a room in this really nice hotel with kind of a water park in it and stuff. And we thought, great, we'll go in Eilat, which is kind of the Las Vegas of Israel. And we'll go and we'll have a vacation. We haven't had one for a long time. And so we went down there, and it was full of Israelis who were also on vacation. But that's okay, but we'll go enjoy the pool, and we couldn't hardly enjoy the pool because they had scheduled activities from morning till night. And I'm not talking about for little kids. They did have kids' activities, but for the grown-ups, they had okay, so now we're going to have dancing in the pool. And now we're going to have, I can't remember what all. It was ridiculous. It was like group swimming, and... So
The whole program.
maybe you should look into that. Yeah. Like a day camp for grown-ups.
They make fun of that on the Marvelous Miss Maisel, which is hilarious, but not at all appropriate. And but they go away to because they're all Jewish, not practicing, and they all go away during the summer because they all live in New York, and they go to the Catskills or whatever or Rockaway. No, whatever. Anyway, they go away for the summer to and it's all Jews at this. Summer camp or whatever, and it's organized activities all day long.
For the grown-ups.
For the grown-ups. They even make a joke where the kid comes in and they're playing Simon Says with the adults, and the dad's like, "This is adult time, go away!" And the kid is looking at him like, "What are you talking about?"
That's funny.
where'd you live in?
Vicenza. It's like half an hour west of it. functioning.
Okay, very good. Thank you, thank you.
So,
What are we reading next?
The Epistle of St. James.
You got that one?
Got that one. Check that off the list.
Are we doing the life of St. Anthony next? Is what's on the list?
Army is blue.
Oh,
The life of St. Anthony's on the list.
I'll have to ask Matthew what we decided
I
on.
know. I
You might be right.
Oh, I don't know, I just,
Now I'm confused.
Life of St. James, then letter of, Life of St. Anthony, then letter of St. James. But, I don't know.
Well, it does, I'll ask,
Then, yeah,
Maybe I looked at it
ask
wrong.
Pete's Pizza.
obviously I haven't prepared for any of them, either of the above yet. So,
Yours says James and Anthony, mine
Just
says.
play by your stuff,
just go week to week.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, mine's Bongo list.
Dusty doesn't even know
And
what's
this.
we'll make a final decision by 11:59 today. I thought we were doing James next week, but,
That's okay, it's okay, I just,
huh?
You're gonna make a final decision by 11:59, when are you gonna discuss it?
11:58.
Yeah, 11:58.
Dusty's up there discussing.
Our first schedule was James, then Anthony, but now I'm confused, since you had it written down somewhere else.
yeah, that's just what I have.
Next week is James, is that?
No, we don't know yet.
We're gonna confer.
11:59.
And you're gonna let us know.
Yes.
Yeah, sometime. If not by today, it'll be by email.
There's some debate as to our schedule of what we're reading next week. I told them I thought we were doing St. James next week.
That's what I assumed.
Okay, we got 2 out of 3 of us then.
Okay,
We'll see what Howard thinks.
Okay,
She had written down Life of Anthony, but I thought we were gonna do James and then Anthony.
That's what was in the listing of the program that when you signed up.
Was Anthony before?
Anthony's fourth.
That's him.
That was the lady who puts things on the website. See, I just defer it all.
There you go. That's right. So, if you turn to 1 Kings, well, we're gonna
Church what? I'm sorry.
1 Kings. So, sometimes there are books that are just that are attributed to historical figures. They're just kind of barely tied. So I'd say 1 Kings 11. We'll start there. They're kind of loosely affiliated with historical events from that person's life. I'm thinking about the Psalms. So many of the Psalms are attributed to David. I do think David did write Psalms. But you look at some of the titles and it'll say, this was written by David when he was pretending to be mad among the Philistines in Ziklag. And you read the psalm and it talks about being in distress or something. But the person who wrote Ecclesiastes took the trouble to throw a little bit, I think he's kind of having fun, really. I told them last week, it's almost like historical jokes, in a way, that are strewn through the book of Ecclesiastes. And you kind of have to know the story of the end of Solomon's life to really appreciate it. And so in 1 Kings chapter 11, it tells us, first of all, about, let's see, where does it talk about Jeroboam?
It's 26.
Go down to... Yes, here we go. Verse 26. So 1 Kings 11:26 tells us about this man who is a rebel against the king. Verse 28, Jeroboam was a very able man, and when Solomon saw that the young man was also a good worker, he put him in charge of all the carriers conscripted from the house of Joseph. And at that time, Jeroboam left Jerusalem, and the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite met him on the road. The prophet was wearing a new cloak, and when the two were alone in the open country, Ahijah took off his new cloak, tore it into 12 pieces, and said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I am about to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand, and will give you 10 of the tribes." Okay? And then Solomon gets wind of this, chases him, he goes to Egypt for a while. While Jeroboam's in Egypt, Solomon dies. All of this is judgment against Solomon for his sins at the end of his life. So you know the story of Solomon. He marries too many women, and from way too many different places, and so he builds the temple, and they all say, well, we want temples for our gods, and he's like, oh sure, why not, and he winds up being led astray by his wives. I'm sorry, ladies. And
It's kind of throughout the Old Testament.
it is. So then in the next chapter, Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam. Keep them straight. You have Jeroboam and you have Rehoboam. Okay? And their names don't mean any. I mean, I know they sound similar, but they don't actually have any relation to each other. So Rehoboam is a young man when he comes to the throne, and he asks his king's advisors, "What should I do to be a good king?" And all of these trusted men from his father's court say, you know, your father had to implement some pretty harsh taxes. And now that the temple is built, the palace is built, we're in a good place with the army and everything, maybe you should start relenting a little bit, make some tax cuts, stop conscripting people in, especially to into like public works. You know, let them all go home, take care of their farms, whatnot. Rehoboam, he says, oh, that sounds pretty good, but I'm going to talk to my friends I've grown up with. And they say, you've got to show these people who's boss. And Rehoboam listens to his friends, of course. So if you go to verse 10. So 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 10. The young men who had grown up with him replied, "This is what you must say to this people who have told you, your father made our yoke heavy, you lighten it for us. You must say, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins." Okay, you understand what he's saying there, right? My father put a heavy yoke on you, but I will make it heavier. My father beat you with whips, but I will beat you with scorpions. So this is his campaign message, right? You know?
Never took the Dale Carnegie course.
Yeah, I don't think you can put all of that on a hat, but this is I will beat you with or a bumper sticker. But this is Rehoboam's campaign message. Yes. And so Jeroboam is he's come back up. Solomon's died, and so he's up there, and gives him a perfect opportunity. He whips everyone into a lather, and so if you go to verse 16, when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What share have we in David? We have no heritage in the son of Jesse. To your tents, Israel, now look to your own house, David." So Israel went off to their tents. But Rehoboam continued to reign over the Israelites who lived in the cities of Judah. So he only really retains one tribe He has the Levites as well, but the Levites don't have any territory. So he really only retains one tribe, one little part out of the whole kingdom of Israel. Okay? We remember the tribe of Judah because they're the ones who will eventually survive. The northern kingdom disappears later, but while these two kingdoms were in existence, the northern kingdom was vastly superior. Much more wealth, culture, and political prowess. The southern kingdom was really kind of a podunk kingdom. So you have the glories of Solomon, who built really an empire, and then in one generation, it's diminished to this one, this little holding in the south. The next part, a lot of people really like this. King Rehoboam then sent out Adoram, this is verse 18, who was in charge of the forced labor. Actually, in the Hebrew it says he was in charge of taxes. Okay, so he sends the IRS man out there, but all Israel stoned him to death. Okay, so so you have all of this in the background, and I hope most of you have heard that story before, but all of Israel would know this story. All of the Jews know this story quite well, and Rehoboam is famous for being a fool. So if you go to the book of Ecclesiastes, let's start with Jeroboam. So Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. And what's kind of cool here is the person who's written this has taken these historical lessons in a way he's kind of turned them into wisdom literature. He's taken these historical incidents and turned them into things to ponder about really what politics can and cannot achieve. He's pretty cynical about politics, really. So verses 13 through 16 in Ecclesiastes 4. Better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who longer knows caution. And I'll go ahead and I think the poor and wise youth is Jeroboam, son of Nebat. And Solomon is the foolish king. There's irony there, of course, right? Because Solomon is the wisest man who ever lived, according to 1 Kings. But here, at the end of his life, taking stock of what's happened, he's like, really, as wise as I am, I'm still a fool. Is kind of what's going on here. Because he no longer knows caution. This idea that he used to be wise, but something has departed from him. For from a prison house he came forth to reign, though poor but wise youth. Despite his kingship, he was born poor. I saw all the living, those who move about under the sun, with the second youth who will succeed him. There is no end to all this people, to all who were before them. Yet the later generations will not have joy in him. This also is vanity and a chase after wind. So he's saying, I saw everybody follow after this youth who was born in, very low estate, and they all followed after him. But he's saying, later generations will not have joy in him. And Jeroboam eventually, he goes to the north, and he winds up, right off the bat, setting up rival sanctuaries for Israel to worship in, and he erects golden calves, and he leads them into sin. And so every king that follows him, it says, they followed after Jeroboam, son of Nebat. They followed after his ways. Until you get to King Ahab. And King Ahab is so wicked that they say everybody followed after Ahab. He becomes the new Jeroboam. So this idea, he was very politically astute, but yet he's not going to bring good things to his people either. They will have no joy in him. So I really think this is talking about Jeroboam. There's some other places in Ecclesiastes that I think are based on Jeroboam, but let's move on to Rehoboam. And this one really makes me laugh. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 17 through 23.
Say that again.
Ecclesiastes
I'm sorry.
chapter 2, verses 17 through 23. Verse 18. I don't know why I put 17. So he says, I detested all the fruits of my toil under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who is to come after me. And who knows whether that one will be wise or a fool? We know, right? we know. So this is really artful literature here. You get Solomon musing over, this Rehoboam, I don't know what kind of king he's going to be. Yet that one will take control of all the fruits of my toil and wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So my heart turned to despair. He's thinking about Rehoboam becoming king. His heart turns to despair over all the fruits of my toil under the sun. For here is one who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill, talking about himself. And that one's legacy must be left to another who has not toiled for it. This is also vanity and a great evil. For what profit comes to mortals from all the toil and anxiety of heart with which they toil under the sun? Every day sorrow and grief are their occupation. Even at night their hearts are not at rest. This also is vanity. I really like these kind of historical notes in Ecclesiastes, and it really is a masterpiece. Whoever wrote this knows the story of Solomon very well, and it doesn't, it's not on the nose. I don't think my notes even say anything about Rehoboam. No, they don't. But I'm pretty sure Rehoboam's there nonetheless. I don't need the NAB notes to tell me this is about Rehoboam.
It's interesting because it seems to kind of fly in the face of what I would have previously assumed to be the high estimation of leaving things to your descendants. And so, like I mentioned, today's first reading at Mass came from Genesis 28, Jacob's dream at Bethel. And so in Genesis 28:13 we read, there was the Lord standing beside him and saying, I, the Lord, am the God of your forefather Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you are lying I will give to you and your descendants. These shall be plentiful as the dust of the earth, and through them you shall spread out east and west, north and south. And so it continues to repeat descendants and land and being a good thing. And so here we have Solomon, and is it because he's jaded by this experience, or is there a purposeful kind of like trying to deflect our emphasis on the physical progeny to something different? It's just reading that just kind of strikes me as that what I normally think of with the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament, and just kind of Western culture and history, is that the idea of providing for future generations and family history and lineage and even property. I know in the modern sense we kind of, people in our kind of egalitarianism, we frown on the idea of like people passing on titles and things like that, but that's a part of our culture. But he's kind of saying like don't store up anything for anybody. It almost sounds selfish if you don't have the backstory there. But reading a man musing about the fact that he doesn't want to leave anything to anyone after him, that is back to where we started. Is this book depressing? That's kind of depressing to me.
Oh yeah, there are things that if you isolated them are depressing. I think you have to. So this is a some.
But it's kind of human nature,
Yeah.
because we worked really hard to get this, like if you had a big company and you worked really hard, you think about like a Bill Gates or somebody that has a lot, and then they think about their kids and they didn't have to work for all that, they just get it, here you go. And do they appreciate it? How do they handle it? I think it's a real true reality.
Somebody's going to inherit it.
Exactly.
and they may do better than you, or they may do worse.
But they
Probably do
didn't earn it
worse.
like you did, so why don't you
No, I think so. Just
Well, that's
yesterday.
usually what, I mean, you know, if you just look at it historically,
Oh yeah.
it doesn't work out.
No.
I mean, it does every now and then, but most of the time, it's you're cursing your kids.
I just heard yesterday I was going somewhere and I had the radio on and somebody was talking, giving financial advice, and he told this story about how his grandparents lived like paupers and never took trips, never ate out. They just amassed everything because they lived through the Depression and they were afraid that that could happen again. And then when they died, they had, not millions and millions of dollars, but they had $600,000 that was just sitting in the bank. And now it had to be, divvied out as an inheritance. And he says all that wealth disappeared like, I mean, this is one of the grandkids. He said all that, because he said inherited wealth is always spent wealth. But when you have to work for it yourself, you have a respect for where that, what went into gaining that. And I think that's kind of the attitude here, is it's just saying that maybe leaving a vast inheritance for your children isn't the best thing for them, because they're not going to respect what you put into it.
Well, like I'm thinking
They'll
of
waste it.
And like
Luke
land,
15,
You think about land
Prodigal
inheritance is like,
Yeah.
like my great grandparents had a name and made a piece of land that was theirs, and it used to be a family thing. You farmed, you kind of built up the land, you tried to increase your land holdings and try to make it more prosperous as time went on, and things have changed so much that kind of has gone away. Because like my mom's farm, she still lives there, but like my sister and I will inherit it, but now it's going to be divided.
Yeah.
And her husband farms, but I don't. So I don't know. It just gets more and more difficult. I think those the inheritance ideas just kind of changed. But I grew up very much that this is the land. You don't sell it. You take care of it. You're a steward of that land, and you need to keep it in the family. Just that whole concept. But my nephews, anything's for sale.
Say we
Just sell it.
liquidate it, because then you can
liquidate
spend
it
it.
and divide it, and like you say, it's gonna be gone. But
Yeah.
like that. What's come down through, 4 generations of people is it makes me sad.
Sure. Yeah. It is so. Yes.
My husband being an only child, and his mom passed away a couple of years ago. She was one that just was, which we did not find out until after her death. His father is still living at 94, and he's just, he said she was one that was scared to death because of the going through the Depression and never having anything, and they lived very fruitfully, not fruitfully, frugally. That was the wrong word, but they did, and my husband had absolutely no idea how much money was being socked away all the time.
Right.
And now Grandpa, he's bound determined. He says, I want to see my only child, and my grandchildren and my I want to see them enjoy this.
Oh wow.
And this has become his goal.
Wow.
And some of the grandkids are saying, what is wrong with Grandpa? Giving away everything, And he goes, I'm not taking it with me.
Yeah.
And I love seeing it being, something being accomplished with it.
Yeah.
If I can help you through your education, if I can, all of these things,
That's good. Yeah, that's
know,
different.
and
That's different,
Yeah.
And he does. I mean, he keeps assuring my husband, don't worry, there's still leaves some there. But, but he's still even to us, I mean, we were over there, it's like, here's a $30,000 check. I've had it for a few weeks here, I keep forgetting to give it to you. My husband's going, Dad, stop. I don't need this. And he goes, enjoy it. I want you guys to go on a trip. I want you to do this. I want you,
It's wonderful.
It's crazy. It's insane. We're going. But then we end up with that same thing, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, what do we do with it?
Yeah.
What do we do with it?
So, again, this whole, it's all about the passing, just the flux of time that you can't, you can sock it away, or you can build this legacy, but there's no insurance that it's going to last more than a generation. So everything is so temporal, and it's just our political security, so I think that's, again, the message of Ecclesiastes, and isolated, it is a depressing thought, but in the context of the rest of the book, it I think actually helps you to hold on loosely to some of these things so that you can actually enjoy them. And
Did you just quote 38 Special?
maybe it seemed apropos.
I like it.
Solomon is kind of like Marcus Aurelius then too, because here Marcus Aurelius willed the empire to covetous.
Yeah.
Just the same way that Solomon willed a great empire to revolt.
Yeah. Who knows
Both became tyrants.
who knows whether or not he'll be a fool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Marcus Aurelius said that too.
Yeah.
No, that's a good,
Yep.
that's a good point.
And kind of, in a way, Solomon, it's a different kind of philosophy, but in a manner of speaking, he's also a philosopher king. So,
Who likes girls?
who likes girls?
Lots of
Did
girls.
Marcus Aurelius really only loved, is
Is
it Fortunata? What was her name? No,
Faustina was his wife.
Faustina. Yeah, that's his.
He was more.
Yeah, he's a little more sober than Solomon is in regards to women.
He seemed a little grumpy that he put it off for so long, though, remember?
I know.
I'm thankful that I waited until the proper time. You're just even past the proper time.
That's right, just a little fast. That's right. Yeah, I don't think Solomon had that problem. So to finish, so maybe we'll have time for some question and answer discussion, but we have to read the last chapter of Ecclesiastes. So Ecclesiastes chapter 12, and which is a beautiful poem about old age. There are a lot of things here that people don't know what to do with. Some of the images. So, for instance, I think that, again, the notes of the New American Bible will lead us astray. Before we read this, it says, the second sentence in the commentary, it says, the poem's enigmatic imagery has often been interpreted allegorically. Above all, it seeks to evoke an atmosphere as well as an attitude toward death and old age. And then it goes in the next one, talks about all the allegorical things. But it's a little ambivalent about the allegory, you can see. But it's poetry, and poetry always employs metaphor. So we'll go through these. Let's read it all together, just so we can kind of enjoy it together, and then maybe go through all of them one by one and try to understand what's going on there. Would one of you want to read it?
I've got the RSV, so what?
Oh, read that, because that's
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw nigh, when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and when the strong men are bent, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look through the windows are dimmed, and the doors on the street are shut, when the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the voice of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. They are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails. Because man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets, before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity.
Okay, so as we just go through this, again, it's kind of a carpe diem. You know, enjoy life while you have it, while you can, and enjoy your youth even while you can, I think is the message here. And to really enjoy your youth properly means remembering your Creator. I think that's important. So in verse 2, again, so there's a tendency to read this as just like some kind of maybe enigmatic, that's the word that's used here. These are all enigmatic, evocative sayings. Maybe they don't really have a particular thing that they're trying to say. And I think that almost all of them have, if not all of them, have a particular reference. So let's just try to think through these. So when it talks about the sun is darkened and the light and the moon and the stars, and then here's the real clue, and the clouds return after the rain. Clouds returning after rain. What? That's absolutely what I was talking about. It's cataracts. I think. So I'll never forget. I studied this. He just went to his reward a few months ago. So my Old Testament professor in Bible college was an old man named Wilbur Fields, and Wilbur had just had cataract surgery before we studied this together. And he went on and on and on about the difference between before and after. And he said, this is exactly what it's like. It's like trying to look through clouds that are like a mist everywhere. The guardians of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent. So, we're talking about the guardians of the house trembling. I think it's just talking about shaking, palsy. And the strong men are bent. The women who grind are idle because they are few. Who are the women who grind?
Teeth?
The teeth. Yeah. And those who look through the windows grow blind. I think that's talking about eyesight again. When the doors to the teeth are shut, and the sound of the mill is low, when the doors to the street are shut, and the sound of the mill is low, when one rises at the call of a bird, and all the daughters of song are quiet. So here's, for example, the NAB goes through and it's trying to figure this all out. Like the eyes of the the doors are the lips, it says, and the daughters of song are the voice. Actually, I think this is all talking about being hard of hearing. Yep, you can't hear the doors being opened and closed on the street. This is a pre-industrial time, so think about, you wouldn't have the air conditioning running all the time, and you'd be able to know when your neighbor's going in and out of their houses. Well, and all of a sudden you don't hear the doors opening and closing anymore, because your hearing is diminishing. And then, you might hear one bird, and then you listen to hear the rest of them, and there's nothing, right? Because one had a particularly sharp song, but the rest of them, I think that's what it's describing. And this is what Wilbur said, and I think Wilbur's right. Some of these are a little less metaphorical, right? Being afraid of heights, being afraid of perils in the street. And then we have the almond tree blooming. Have any of you seen an almond tree in bloom? It has white flowers. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so white hair. And also, then we have the locust growing sluggish. And I'll never forget, Wilbur was very, very plain with us and said he thought that this is talking about impotence. So,
Are all appetites
and then,
with age?
yes, yeah. And then the caperberry, which yours said, what does it say in the RSV? It was like desire.
Desire fails.
Yeah.
Knox says the spiced food untasted.
Yes,
Because you do lose a sense of taste.
that's right. So,
It says a stain.
right. So, all of the, I'm not sure, I don't think caper, I'm not sure we know what it is, but we know it's some kind of food additive, something to stimulate the appetite. But after a certain point, and we see people at the very end of their lives, they do lose their appetites, and they just, it's hard. You see people trying to force them to eat. I remember my grandparents, and they just didn't want to eat anymore. They didn't need to eat as much. And then you have the beautiful imagery of death, right? The silver cord snapping, the golden bowl breaking, the pitcher being shattered at the spring. So all of this, again, on the one hand, I mean, death is sad, and there's you could become depressed, but he's also affirming the goodness of life here. Right? It's a golden bowl, a silver cord. These aren't. So he's gone through the whole book saying that life is, again, I don't think he's saying it's meaningless, but he's saying it's transitory. It passes by, and then there's an end. It's not going to last forever.
My husband and I, he loves watching movies. And he started watching these films, and I said, why are you watching these? He says, well, it's called Rumors of Angels. And it was a story about a young boy who had lost his mother when he was even much younger. And how he's being, he doesn't accept his father remarrying him, But anyway, he does become friends with this elderly lady, and she reminds him that death is like a schoolboy jumping through the door with joy.
Wow.
At the end of the day.
Yep.
To go.
Class is dismissed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then she passes away.
Yeah.
And he is there he is the only one there.
Mm-hmm.
And that, and of course, he repeats that, and he accepts it. She's okay.
Yeah.
She jumped with joy.
Yeah.
Where she was.
Now, I will say, I don't think that Ecclesiastes is jumping through the door of death with joy.
Yeah,
He's resigned
but
to it,
Yeah,
but
but she kind of went through some of these things,
Sure.
like you're saying,
Yeah.
because of her age.
yeah. I think what you're describing is really a reflection of Christian hope. And I think it's important to remember
Right.
that he doesn't have that. That's coming in the drama of the Revelation history, but he doesn't
He doesn't
know that, and so for him, and I think that's one of the things that's remarkable about this. Here's a man who he's very open about this. I don't know what's going to happen when I die. He's not relishing that moment, but he does have a peace here.
Why does he
That's a
refer to it as this silver cord?
oh, that's the life.
Right.
That's not death. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
He's recalling.
I don't think he really, if he had his druthers, I think he would keep that silver cord intact.
Okay.
He's not in, but he also knows this is what happens. You can't fight it. So this is why I think it's more stoic than Epicurean. This just kind of resignation to one's fate and accepting it and then enjoying what you can of it before you have to go on. I think we should read the epilogue because it's also beautiful as well. And then you have a little bit more of a, I guess, a theistic feel here at the end. Although, all through Ecclesiastes, he certainly does have, he's acknowledging the presence of God all the time. But here it has more of an ethical, I would say, feel too. So besides being wise, Kohelet, my translation says, taught the people knowledge and weighed, scrutinized, and arranged many proverbs. Kohelet sought to find appropriate sayings and to write down true sayings with precision. The sayings of the wise are like goads, like fixed spikes are the collected sayings given by one shepherd. As to more than these, my son, beware. Of the making of many books there is no end, and in much study there is weariness for the flesh. So I think it's acknowledging the irony of here's another book,
Or of us reading it in a books class.
Yeah, right, yes, that's true. That's true. The last word when all is heard, fear God and keep his commandments, for this concerns all humankind. Because God will bring to judgment every work with all its hidden qualities, whether good or bad. So that's the last word is keep God's commandment. So the thing is, Ecclesiastes barely touches on matters of Torah, and then here at the end he kind of says, okay, observe Torah if you want to have a good life, because you're going to have, there will be judgment.
Well, then how is it, I guess I'm confused, it's like he changes his mind, he's not so agnostic at the end, because, I mean, I guess, I know agnosticism is not knowing, like I'm not sure one way or the other, I'm hedging my bets, is that what he's doing? Follow the law?
I think for him judgment doesn't mean what it means for us.
Okay.
He's not necessarily sure if there's going to be an afterlife
Yeah.
that comes out of that judgment.
I think he does believe there is some kind of afterlife, but he doesn't know what it is.
Yeah.
But he is certain that God is a just judge, and somehow you're going to have to answer for what you've done. I think part of, just it might be a very earthly sort of judgment. Whether what you've worked for is going to last or if it's going to pass away, that, I think maybe in those sorts of terms. The idea of like deferred reward is something that there's not very much of that in the Old Testament. That comes later.
Is there any talk of that being or speculation that that's a later?
I think there is.
Addition.
Yeah.
I just
I
wondered,
don't like
'cause
that though. I mean, it could be, but
Yeah.
Kind of hard to say when you don't know when the text was.
Right,
written.
yeah.
that's true.
It's later than when, I don't know.
I will say this, when you read it in Hebrew, it is of a piece with the rest of there. It doesn't read like it's been inserted by another hand.
Yeah.
So,
Because I tend to agree with Anne Marie that it does seem, verse 14 seems pretty far removed from him saying that there might not be a difference between what happens to you and what happens to a beast, you know?
well, I'm not sure that judgment necessarily means afterlife,
Yeah.
even. He could be saying, you know, in terms of like a temporal
Yeah,
blessings, punishments.
yeah, I guess that's true. I guess we're reading that, thinking of,
Thinking-
we're very concerned with afterlife.
Think in terms of 1 Kings again. So the civil war between the northern kingdom of Israel and Judah, that is judgment on Solomon.
Yeah.
That if you read Adonijah, when he goes to Jeroboam, he's saying God's going to do this to Solomon. So that's the way they kind of think in that stage.
It might be manifested
Hmm.
in later
So
generations.
like in the New Testament, when you spoke of the blind man,
Yeah.
that was his judgment. His
That's right.
parents probably did something wrong.
Right. So there's this kind of thought pattern that's all through the Old Testament, and we know there's truth to that. There are this world consequences for our behaviors. It's not all something we're going to have to answer for in the next life, but
And he's not totally, I mean, chapter 8, there's that whole passage from 8 to 13 where he's talking about judgment and what
Yeah.
happens, what happens to sinners. I mean, I don't think that's not that new.
yeah, I feel like
Nothing
it.
new under the book.
There's nothing new in the book. Yeah, he's already said it
Yeah, he
before.
said it.
I would agree, Stephanie. Any other questions or comments? Maybe one or two.
I do have one historical comment. In Parliament of Edward VI, a man in the House of Commons got in trouble because he rose up and spoke and said, "Woe to the land that has young blood upon the throne." When Edward VI, so he
wow.
ended up in the Tower of London for a while. And under Elizabeth I, he would be hanged, drawn, and quartered.
Wow.
Blessed John Story.
Who was it?
Blessed John Story.
Oh my goodness.
So
So
he opposed the Protestant rule from the beginning.
by quoting
Woe to a land
by quoting the
that
Bible.
has blood on the throne.
he had some chutzpah to quote the Bible to some Protestant.
To the young Jeroboam.
Yeah.
Is a-
That's short enough to be a bumper sticker. What
Woe to the young blood sits on the throne.
I was curious about one thing in the footnotes that you said was referring to the locust, sluggish locust.
Mm-hmm.
Who was your friend in the Old Testament, Willie?
Wilberfield.
Wilberfield. Said it was
It was impotence.
impotence, but in my
Yeah.
book, it
I know.
involved- I guess, well, that's a patriarchal kind of interpretation, I'm thinking, because mine is more addressed, because it's newer, I guess, my Bible's a bit newer, and it's more of a two gender, so it says the stiffness and the movement of
Yep.
age, which would include women.
Yep, that's the New American Bible Comments.
I
Yeah.
just am realizing some of these things as we're going along.
I will say the only place I've ever heard that was from Brother Fields. But it kind of makes sense with most of this is all physiological and like got different organs that
Well,
are
that's
less.
true, but that one, impotence is more of a.
The reason I think it's about impotence is if you look at what follows about the caperberry is all about desire for food. So he's talking about sexual desire and then food, appetite for food. So I think
Well,
it.
that could be sexual, less
Yeah.
than sexual desire for
Oh, yeah.
women for old age. Could be true too.
That's true.
It's just not as visible.
Yeah. Yes, Kim.
Old Testament translation do you most recommend?
Okay. I really like the RSV. I bring the New American Bible because that's what most people have. So I kind of have access to it in front of me. But the RSV is... Here's the reason I like it. The New American Bible has a tendency to over-translate. When it comes to something that's a little weird, that it can't make sense of, they'll paraphrase it, or they try to make it understandable. Whereas the RSV just does a word-for-word translation. I think it's more beautiful as well. I really don't like the way the New American Bible sounds. It's not a beautiful translation.
When was it published?
Huh?
When was it published?
The RSV?
Well,
Or
no,
the-
the New American Bible.
Well, this is the 2011 revision.
Oh, because the reason I'm asking, I have my grandmother's Bible that was
Mhm.
printed in 55. Did that align more with the
probably-
RSV Bible, probably?
I think that's the Confraternity,
Yeah, confraternity.
which is the ancestor of the New American Bible.
Oh,
But it's a lot better.
Yes, yes.
okay.
The RSV is actually it's derived from the King James Version. That's the base text that is revised. And so it carries a little bit of the majesty of the King James Version, and yeah, it's just a beautiful translation. I think it's good to compare translations, not just read one, but the RSV, that's my favorite. Yeah, I see you have it too. It's good.
So the Epistle of St. James next week?